I was the ugly maid until the night a red dress made an entire ballroom forget who they thought I was. The doors of the Castellano Grand Ballroom stood nearly 20 feet tall, polished oak glowing beneath chandeliers that poured warm light across the marble floor. And as those doors slowly opened, conversations that had filled the room only seconds earlier began to fade like music drifting away down a long hallway. Dominic Castellano noticed the silence first. Men like him always did. At 34 years old, Dominic had built a reputation across Manhattan for seeing what others missed, the small shifts in energy that revealed far more than words ever could. He stood near the center of the ballroom in a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked like it had been poured onto him, his posture relaxed but watchful as guests in designer gowns and black tuxedos mingled beneath the crystal chandeliers. This was his engagement celebration, an event his fiancée Victoria Langley had spent months planning, inviting socialites, investors, and powerful families from every corner of New York. Champagne glasses clinked. Soft jazz drifted from a quartet in the corner. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Yet suddenly the room grew quiet. Dominic turned toward the entrance. The towering doors had opened just wide enough for a single figure to step inside. At first, no one seemed to breathe. The woman standing there wore a red dress, the kind of deep crimson that caught the golden chandelier light and turned it into something almost luminous. The fabric moved gently as she walked forward, each step calm, unhurried, the heels of her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Dominic frowned slightly, searching his memory, because something about her felt familiar even though the entire room stared as if they had never seen her before. Across the ballroom, Victoria paused mid-sentence while speaking with her parents, her expression tightening as she followed the direction of every other gaze in the room. A whisper moved through the crowd. Someone near the champagne table leaned toward another guest and murmured, "Is that?" The sentence never finished, because the truth was impossible to ignore. Just 3 hours earlier, the woman now crossing the ballroom in that red dress had been invisible to everyone here. 3 hours earlier, she had been carrying silver trays through the kitchen corridors of the Castellano estate wearing a gray housekeeping uniform. Her name was Lena Carter, and most people in this building barely knew it. The staff simply called her the maid. Others had used harsher words. Earlier that evening, one of the catering assistants had laughed as Lena passed by with a tray of glasses and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "Careful, the ugly maid might scare the guests if she walks upstairs tonight." The comment had drawn a few careless chuckles. Lena had lowered her eyes and kept walking, because surviving in a place like this meant learning when silence was safer than dignity. But now, as the same guests stared in stunned disbelief, the woman they had mocked moved across the ballroom with quiet confidence, her shoulders straight, her dark curls resting naturally against the red fabric of the dress. And for the first time that night, Dominic Castellano realized something that made him straighten slightly where he stood. He had seen this woman before, not as a servant carrying trays, not as someone passing through the background of his home, but somewhere else, somewhere long before tonight, somewhere that made the strange feeling in his chest grow stronger with every step she took toward the center of the room. And for reasons he could not yet explain, Dominic Castellano suddenly could not look away. 3 hours earlier, the Castellano estate had been alive with preparation long before the first limousine arrived at the front gate. And in the long service corridor beneath the grand ballroom, Lena Carter moved quietly from one task to the next with the steady rhythm she had practiced every day since she began working there 8 months ago. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh linen, and overhead lights reflected off the spotless tile floors as staff hurried past carrying trays, flower arrangements, and boxes of glassware. Lena kept her eyes focused on the silver tray balanced carefully in her hands as she stepped through the kitchen doorway, where chefs were arranging plates with precise attention, their voices low but urgent as the evening's schedule ticked closer. Her gray housekeeping uniform was simple and worn from many washes, the sleeves rolled slightly at the wrists, and her dark curls were pulled back loosely so they would not fall across her face while she worked. She had learned quickly that moving quietly made life easier in a place like this. The guests did not notice staff who blended into the background. The guests preferred it that way. Lena passed a group of catering assistants near the service elevator just as one of them glanced up and nudged the man beside him with an amused grin. "Look who is headed upstairs tonight," he said loudly enough that several others turned. "Careful. The ugly maid might scare the guests before dessert is even served." A few chuckles echoed through the corridor, casual and careless, the kind that carried no hesitation because no one expected Lena to respond. She did not stop walking. She did not argue. She simply kept moving toward the laundry room, where fresh table linens were stacked in neat piles waiting to be delivered to the ballroom above. Silence had become a habit she carried like an extra uniform. In the early weeks, she had tried to explain herself, to answer small jokes with polite smiles, but she soon learned that explanations only invited more laughter. Now she let the comments pass over her like wind against a closed window. Still, as she set the tray down on the long folding table inside the laundry room, her reflection caught her attention in the stainless steel door of one of the washing machines. The metal surface warped the image slightly, but she could still see the details others had turned into easy jokes. Her skin was dark and warm in tone, her features soft, her natural curls impossible to tame completely. She had never believed there was anything wrong with her appearance, yet in rooms filled with polished marble and expensive perfume it often felt as though the world expected her to shrink into the background. Lena reached for a folded white tablecloth and draped it over her arm before returning to the hallway, her steps steady as she headed toward the back staircase that led up to the ballroom floor. Above her, the faint sound of music drifted through the ceiling as the jazz quartet warmed up for the evening, and through the narrow service window, she could see the first line of black sedans arriving outside the front entrance. Tonight was not just another party. It was Dominic Castellano's engagement celebration, an event the entire city's elite seemed eager to attend. For the guests, it would be an evening of champagne, music, and elegant speeches. For Lena, it would be another long shift moving quietly through crowded rooms, refilling glasses and clearing plates without drawing attention. That was how the night was supposed to unfold. That was how every night usually unfolded for someone in her position. And yet as she climbed the narrow staircase toward the ballroom level, something in the back of her mind stirred with a strange sense that this evening would not end the way it began. By the time Lena Carter reached the ballroom level, the transformation of the estate was nearly complete. Just an hour earlier, the vast room had been quiet except for the sounds of ladders being moved and chandeliers being polished, but now every corner glowed with warm golden light that reflected across the marble floor like sunlight on water. Round tables dressed in crisp white linen stretched across the room in perfect symmetry, each centerpiece arranged with pale roses and tall glass candles that flickered softly even before the first guest arrived. From the balcony above, the musicians were already tuning their instruments, gentle notes drifting through the air as if the room itself was taking a slow breath before the night began. Lena stepped through the service doorway carrying a stack of folded napkins and moved carefully along the edge of the room where the staff prepared for the evening. She placed the linens beside the catering table where rows of polished silver trays waited for their first round of champagne glasses. Around her, the other employees spoke in quick whispers, checking lists and adjusting details while the estate manager paced the floor with the focused attention of someone determined that nothing would go wrong. A few of the catering assistants glanced in Lena's direction as she passed. One of them gave a quiet laugh that carried just enough for her to hear. "Hard to believe she is going to be walking around this ballroom tonight," he said to the man beside him. "This place is full of investors and celebrities. They might think the help came straight from the basement." The second man smirked, but said nothing, and the conversation dissolved into the clinking sound of glassware being arranged. Lena continued walking as if the words had not reached her ears, though she felt them settle somewhere deep and familiar inside her chest. She had grown used to that tone. In houses like this, beauty was measured in expensive fabrics and perfect hair, and anyone outside that image became easy entertainment. Lena set the final stack of napkins on the table and turned toward the tall windows along the ballroom wall. Through the glass, she could see the long driveway curving toward the iron gates where the first line of sleek black cars was already approaching. Their headlights cut softly across the darkening sky as the evening settled over the estate. Soon the doors would open and the world inside the ballroom would fill with laughter, music, and elegant conversations. Staff members began forming lines near the service stations while the head coordinator clapped his hands once to gather attention. "Everyone remember your positions," he said firmly. Guests begin arriving in 20 minutes. Keep movement quiet and stay along the perimeter. Tonight must be flawless. Lena nodded along with the others and picked up an empty tray, preparing for the first round of drinks that would be served once the doors opened. She moved toward the side corridor where the kitchen staff would hand out glasses of sparkling water and champagne, her steps calm and practiced. Yet as she reached the corridor in trance, she paused for a moment and glanced back toward the ballroom floor. The chandeliers shimmered above the tables like suspended constellations, and the soft music echoing through the room made everything feel distant and dreamlike. For a brief second, Lena imagined what it might feel like to walk across that floor as a guest rather than someone carrying trays. The thought surprised her, and she shook her head lightly before stepping back into the corridor where the rhythm of work waited. The night ahead promised long hours and careful silence, just like every other event she had served since arriving at the estate. And yet somewhere deep inside her, beneath the routine and the quiet endurance, the same strange feeling stirred again. The faint sense that this evening would ask something unexpected of her before it was over. The first guests began arriving just after sunset, their voices and laughter flowing through the grand entrance as if the estate itself had come alive. From her position near the service corridor, Lena Carter watched the ballroom slowly transform from a quiet, glowing space into the center of an elegant social world she had never truly belonged to. Women in silk gowns stepped carefully across the marble floor, while men in tailored tuxedos greeted one another with easy confidence, their conversations floating through the air alongside the soft notes of the jazz quartet, now playing from the balcony above. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light as trays of champagne began circulating through the room, and the scent of fresh flowers mixed with expensive perfume created an atmosphere that felt almost unreal compared to the quiet service corridors below. Lena moved along the outer edge of the ballroom carrying a tray of sparkling water glasses, her steps steady and measured as she approached small groups of guests. Most people accepted the drinks without looking directly at her, their attention fixed instead on conversations about business, travel, and the latest headlines from Manhattan social circles. She had learned to navigate these rooms the way someone moves through a library, quiet and unnoticed, careful never to interrupt the rhythm of those who believed the evening belonged entirely to them. Near the center of the ballroom, a ripple of attention spread suddenly through the crowd as Dominic Castellano entered beside his fiancée Victoria Langley. Dominic's presence carried a natural authority that drew eyes without effort, his dark suit sharp against the warm light of the chandeliers, while Victoria's pale silver gown shimmered as she greeted guests with practiced elegance. Laughter followed them as friends and investors gathered close, offering congratulations and raising glasses in celebration of the engagement that had already become the city's most discussed social event. Lena approached the group carefully and extended the tray toward a cluster of guests standing near Victoria. One woman lifted a glass and then paused, her gaze drifting slowly over Lena's uniform and simple appearance. A faint smile appeared on her face, the kind that carried amusement more than kindness. "Victoria," the woman said lightly, just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear, "your staff is certainly memorable." Victoria turned her head and followed the direction of the woman's gaze until her eyes landed on Lena. For a brief moment, she studied her with a cool, assessing expression that made Lena feel as though she had stepped unexpectedly into a spotlight. Then Victoria gave a soft laugh that sounded almost polite. "Yes," she replied smoothly, lifting a glass from the tray. "Every house has its little surprises." A few guests nearby chuckled. Quietly, Lena lowered her eyes and stepped back without speaking, her hands steady even though the words settled heavily in the air around her. She moved toward another group of guests along the ballroom wall, offering drinks and collecting empty glasses with the same calm professionalism she had practiced since arriving at the estate. Yet as she continued her quiet path around the room, she could feel the lingering weight of those small comments, the way they turned a person into something to be examined rather than respected. Across the ballroom, Dominic Castellano spoke with several investors, but his attention drifted briefly toward the movement of staff along the edges of the room. For a moment his eyes followed Lena as she passed beneath the glow of a chandelier, before disappearing once again into the quiet rhythm of service. The evening carried on with music and laughter, but somewhere beneath the polished surface of celebration a subtle tension had begun to grow, the quiet feeling that the night still held a moment none of them had yet imagined. The music drifted gently through the ballroom as the evening continued, each passing minute adding more laughter and polished conversation to the elegant celebration. Lena Carter moved quietly along the perimeter of the room, her tray balanced carefully in both hands as she replaced empty glasses with fresh ones and cleared away the small traces left behind by the growing crowd. The rhythm of service had become almost automatic to her by now. Step forward, offer the tray, step back, move on. It was a quiet choreography she had learned to perform without drawing attention, and in most moments that invisibility felt like protection. Yet tonight the atmosphere felt different. The small comments from earlier had not disappeared into the noise of the party the way they usually did. They lingered in the air like faint echoes that refused to fade. Lena approached a group gathered near one of the tall windows where Victoria Langley stood with several women dressed in gowns that shimmered with delicate embroidery. Their voices carried the light confidence of people accustomed to being admired. Lena paused beside them and offered the tray of champagne. One woman reached for a glass while studying Lena with open curiosity, her gaze moving slowly from the plain gray uniform to the tray in her hands. "Victoria," the woman said with a soft laugh, "you truly keep an interesting staff." Another woman leaned closer and whispered something that made the group exchange amused glances. Victoria took a sip of champagne and looked directly at Lena, as if considering an unusual piece of decoration in the room. "You should stay near the service hallway tonight," she said calmly, her tone gentle but unmistakably dismissive. "The guests prefer a certain atmosphere." A few of the women smiled behind their glasses. Lena felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but kept her posture steady. She lowered the tray slightly and nodded once before turning away without a word. Silence was safer. Silence kept the night moving forward. As she stepped back toward the edge of the ballroom, the glow of the chandeliers reflected across the polished floor, and for a moment, she caught sight of her own reflection again in the marble surface beneath her feet. The image looked small and distant compared to the towering room around her. She continued walking until she reached the quiet service corridor where the noise of the party softened behind the heavy door. Inside the corridor the air felt cooler and calmer, the sounds of clinking dishes and murmured instructions replacing the bright laughter from the ballroom. Lena set the tray down on a preparation table and took a slow breath she had been holding since the conversation near the window. Across the room, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the older woman who supervised the kitchen staff, looked up from arranging plates and studied Lena carefully. Eleanor had worked in the Castellano estate longer than anyone else on the service team and possessed the quiet awareness of someone who understood people better than they realized. She walked over slowly and rested one hand on the edge of the table. "You heard them," Eleanor said softly. It was not a question. Lena gave a small nod but kept her eyes on the tray. "It does not matter," she replied calmly. Eleanor watched her for another moment, then glanced toward the closed door leading back into the ballroom, where the music and laughter continued. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, one that felt almost conspiratorial. "Child," she said gently, "sometimes the world only sees what it expects to see." Lena looked up, confused by the sudden seriousness in the older woman's expression. Eleanor reached beneath the preparation table and lifted a garment bag that had been resting there unnoticed. She placed it carefully on the table between them and slowly unzipped it just enough to reveal a glimpse of deep crimson fabric inside. The rich color caught the corridor light like a quiet flame. Lena stared at it, unsure what she was looking at or why it had suddenly appeared in front of her. Eleanor closed the bag again and met her eyes with a knowing smile. "Tonight," she said softly, "you might give them something unexpected to look at." For a moment Lena Carter simply stared at the garment bag resting on the table as if it had appeared from nowhere. The deep crimson fabric she had glimpsed only seconds earlier lingered in her mind like the afterimage of a flame. In the quiet service corridor, the distant music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the walls, a soft rhythm that reminded her the celebration continued just beyond the door. Glassware clinked in the kitchen behind them while staff moved quickly through their duties. But the small space between Lena and Eleanor Brooks suddenly felt strangely still. Lena hesitated before speaking, her voice careful and uncertain. "Mrs. Brooks, that is not for me." Eleanor's expression softened with the patience of someone who had heard similar protests many times before. She folded her arms loosely and leaned one shoulder against the table as though she had been waiting for this exact reaction. "Why not?" she asked gently. Lena looked down at the garment bag again, the rich color barely visible through the opening of the zipper. Even hidden, it seemed far too elegant for someone wearing a gray housekeeping uniform. "Because I work here," Lena answered quietly. "That dress belongs in the ballroom, not in the hallway with me." Eleanor gave a small smile, the kind that carried both warmth and quiet determination. "Exactly," she replied. Without waiting for permission, she pulled the zipper down another few inches, revealing more of the dress inside. The fabric was smooth and luminous beneath the overhead lights, its deep red color richer than anything Lena had ever worn before. The dress looked simple at first glance, yet every line of the stitching suggested a quiet elegance that would draw attention in any room. Lena felt her breath catch slightly as she looked at it more closely. "Where did it come from?" she asked. Eleanor lifted the dress carefully from the bag and held it up for a moment so the light could pass across the fabric. "A friend of mine worked wardrobe for a theater company in Brooklyn," she explained. "They closed last winter and donated a few costumes to charity. This one never found a new owner." Lena shook her head gently, already stepping back. "I cannot wear something like that tonight. I am supposed to be serving drinks." Eleanor studied her with a thoughtful gaze before lowering the dress back onto the table. "You have been serving everyone in this house for months," she said calmly. "You have kept your head down while people decided what you were worth before they even knew your name." Lena did not answer. The words were not unkind, but they felt uncomfortably accurate. Eleanor reached out and touched the sleeve of Lena's uniform. "Look at you," she continued softly. "You walk into that ballroom every night like you are apologizing for taking up space. But that is not who you are." Lena felt a quiet tension rise in her chest, the same feeling she had pushed away countless times before. "Mrs. Brooks," she said slowly, "it is easier this way." Eleanor nodded once as if acknowledging the truth in that statement. "Yes," she replied, "it is easier." Then she straightened slightly and placed the red dress gently into Lena's hands. The fabric felt surprisingly light. "But sometimes," Eleanor added, her voice steady, "the easiest way is not the one that reminds people who you really are." Lena stood there holding the dress, unsure what to say, while the music from the ballroom continued drifting faintly through the corridor walls. For the first time that evening, the strange feeling that had been following her all night grew stronger, as if the quiet moment in the hallway had opened a door she had never considered walking through before. The red dress rested in Lena Carter's hands long after Eleanor Brooks stepped away to return to the kitchen, leaving her alone in the quiet corridor with a decision she had never expected to face. The distant music from the ballroom drifted through the walls like a reminder of the world waiting just beyond the door, a world filled with laughter, champagne, and people who had already decided exactly who she was. Lena looked down at the dress again. The fabric was softer than she imagined, the deep crimson color glowing even beneath the plain corridor lights. It did not belong in a service hallway. It belonged beneath chandeliers and camera flashes and conversations that never included someone wearing a gray housekeeping uniform. For a moment, she almost placed it back inside the garment bag and returned to the steady rhythm of work she understood so well. That path was safe. That path was familiar. But Eleanor's words lingered in her mind with quiet persistence. Sometimes the easiest way is not the one that reminds people who you really are. Lena exhaled slowly and glanced toward the closed door leading back into the ballroom. Through the thick wood she could still hear the gentle swell of jazz music and the faint echo of laughter. Somewhere inside that room, Dominic Castellano was greeting investors and friends, while Victoria Langley accepted congratulations from people who admired her polished elegance. The evening continued exactly as everyone expected. Lena shifted her gaze to the small staff dressing room located at the end of the corridor. The door stood slightly open, revealing a narrow space with a mirror mounted above a simple countertop. She hesitated only a second before walking toward it. Inside the room, the bright overhead light reflected off the mirror as she stepped forward and carefully laid the red dress across the counter. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. The same uniform, the same tired curls, The same quiet expression she had carried into this house every day for 8 months. Lena studied the reflection silently, as if seeing it for the first time. She thought about the whispers earlier in the ballroom, the polite laughter that followed Victoria's comment, the way people glanced at her, as though she were a misplaced object in an otherwise perfect room. None of those memories surprised her anymore. But tonight something about them felt different, as if the words had reached a place inside her that refused to stay silent any longer. She touched the sleeve of her uniform and then looked again at the dress resting on the counter beside her. Slowly she reached for the zipper of the garment bag and pulled it open completely. The fabric unfolded like a deep red ribbon of light. Lena lifted the dress carefully and held it in front of the mirror. The color contrasted sharply against the gray uniform she wore, and for a moment she imagined what the room upstairs might look like if she walked across the ballroom floor, wearing something like this instead of carrying trays along the wall. The thought felt impossible, yet it also felt strangely powerful. Lena set the dress down again and closed her eyes briefly, steadying the sudden rush of uncertainty in her chest. When she opened them again, her reflection seemed different somehow, not because her appearance had changed, but because the decision waiting in front of her had finally become clear. Tonight she could continue moving quietly through the ballroom as the maid everyone ignored. Or she could step into that room as someone they had never bothered to imagine. The decision settled quietly inside Lena Carter like the final note of a song that had been building all evening. For several seconds she remained standing in the small dressing room, the red dress resting across her hands while the soft hum of music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the corridor outside. The mirror reflected a woman caught between two versions of herself. One wore the familiar gray uniform of a housemaid, invisible and predictable. The other was someone Lena had never allowed the world to see. Slowly she reached for the buttons of the uniform and began to change. The fabric of the dress slipped over her shoulders with surprising ease, light and cool against her skin. It fit as if it had been waiting for her all along, the deep crimson color flowing gently to the floor in a simple but elegant line. Lena stood still for a moment after adjusting the final fold of fabric, her hands resting lightly at her sides as she looked at the reflection in front of her. The woman staring back from the mirror looked unfamiliar at first. Her dark curls framed her face naturally, the red of the dress catching the light and giving her posture a quiet confidence that had never existed in the gray uniform. She did not look like someone hiding in a service corridor anymore. She looked like someone who belonged beneath the chandeliers upstairs. Lena took a slow breath and turned toward the door of the dressing room. The hallway beyond remained busy with the quiet movement of staff preparing the next course for the celebration. For a moment, she wondered if someone might stop her, if the transformation would draw questions she was not ready to answer. But as she stepped into the corridor, the people moving past were too focused on their own tasks to notice anything unusual. Plates clattered softly in the kitchen, a waiter hurried by carrying a tray of glasses, and the music from the ballroom grew slightly louder as she walked toward the service stairway. Each step felt both strange and steady, as if the rhythm of the evening itself was guiding her forward. When Lena reached the staircase, she paused briefly at the bottom step and listened. The sound of laughter echoed faintly from above along with the smooth melody of the jazz quartet. The celebration continued without interruption, the guests unaware that the quiet decision made in a small corridor downstairs was about to change the atmosphere of the entire room. Lena began climbing the staircase slowly, the fabric of the red dress moving softly with each step. The closer she came to the ballroom level, the brighter the glow of chandelier light became at the top of the stairs. Finally, she reached the final landing, where the tall oak doors stood partially closed. Through the narrow opening, she could see glimpses of the celebration inside. Guests stood in elegant clusters around the tables, glasses raised as they listened to Dominic Castellano speaking with a group of investors near the center of the room. Victoria Langley stood nearby, her silver gown reflecting the warm light as she laughed at something one of the guests had said. Lena placed her hand lightly on the edge of the door and hesitated for just a second. All evening the ballroom had been a place she moved through quietly along the walls. Now it waited in front of her like an entirely different world. With one steady motion, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The music continued for 2 more notes before something subtle shifted in the room. One guest turned. Then another. Conversation slowed. Heads turned toward the entrance as the woman in the red dress walked calmly across the marble floor. And one by one the voices in the ballroom faded into silence.